The sun was setting behind the hills as General Robert Johnson drove his black government sedan through the quiet streets of Pine Valley. He had been driving for 3 hours straight, heading to an important military meeting that couldn't wait. His uniform was pressed, his medals gleaming, and his mind focused on the classified briefing he was about to attend. Robert had served his country for 25 years. He started as a young soldier and worked his way up through dedication, courage, and countless sacrifices. Now, at 52, he held one of the highest positions in the Army. People saluted him, respected him, and looked up to him. But right now, he was just a man trying to get to work on time. The small town of Pine Valley looked peaceful. White picket fences lined the streets. Children played in their yards, and everything seemed normal. Robert barely noticed the police car parked behind the old gas station until he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Really, he muttered to himself, checking his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. In fact, he was driving exactly at the speed limit, just like he always did. Military training had taught him to follow rules precisely. He pulled over to the side of the road and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched a police officer get out of the patrol car. The officer was tall, stocky, and walked with an aggressive swagger that immediately put Robert on edge. Something about the way the officer approached his car didn't feel right. Officer Danny Walsh had been having a bad day. His wife was angry at him. His boss had criticized his work, and he was looking for someone to take his frustration out on. When he saw the expensive-looking black car with tinted windows, he figured he'd found his target. Danny knocked on the window harder than necessary. Robert rolled it down slowly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, another habit from his military training. "License and registration," Danny barked without any greeting or explanation. "Good evening, officer," Robert said politely. "May I ask why you stopped me?" "You were speeding," Danny lied, his voice already hostile. Robert remained calm. "I don't believe I was speeding, sir. I was going exactly 35 miles per hour in a 35 zone." This response only made Danny angrier. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone who looked confident and educated. "Don't argue with me. Give me your license and registration now." Robert slowly reached for his wallet, making sure to announce his movements. "I'm reaching for my identification, officer." He pulled out his military ID card along with his driver's license. "I'm General Robert Johnson with the United States Army." Danny looked at the cards with suspicion. The military ID looked official, with its holographic seal and Robert's picture in uniform. But Danny had made up his mind about this traffic stop, and he wasn't going to let facts get in his way. "This is fake," Danny announced, holding up the military ID. "You think I'm stupid? You can buy these things online." Robert felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "Officer, that's a genuine military identification. You can verify it by calling the base or—" "Step out of the car," Danny interrupted, his hand moving to his weapon. "You're under arrest for presenting false identification to a police officer." Robert couldn't believe what was happening. In all his years of service through wars and dangerous missions, he had never felt as powerless as he did at this moment. "Officer, please. Just call the number on the ID. They can verify who I am in 2 minutes. Get out of the car now," Danny shouted, attracting the attention of people walking nearby. Robert knew he had to comply. Fighting would only make things worse, and he had too much experience dealing with difficult situations to let his emotions take control. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Danny ordered. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Robert felt humiliated but not surprised. He had heard stories like this from other black service members, but experiencing it himself was different. The metal was cold against his skin, and he could feel people staring at him from across the street. "You have the right to remain silent." Danny began reading the Miranda rights, clearly enjoying the power he held over someone who had probably never been arrested before. Robert's government sedan contained classified documents and communication equipment. His absence from the upcoming meeting would trigger security protocols. But right now, all he could do was cooperate and hope that someone would notice he was missing before this situation got completely out of control. As Danny pushed him toward the police car, Robert caught sight of his reflection in the window. He saw a decorated general being treated like a common criminal, and he wondered how many other people had experienced this same injustice without having the resources to fight back. The drive to the police station was silent, except for the radio chatter. Danny felt satisfied with his arrest, completely unaware that he had just detained one of the most important military officers in the country. Robert sat quietly in the back seat, already planning his next moves and thinking about the phone call he would need to make. Neither man realized that this traffic stop would soon become national news, or the tanks would be rolling through the quiet streets of Pine Valley before the night was over. The Pine Valley Police Station was a small, outdated building that looked more like a town hall than a law enforcement facility. As Danny Walsh pulled into the parking lot with his prisoner, he felt proud of himself. In his mind, he had just arrested someone trying to impersonate a military officer, which was a serious federal crime. Robert sat in the back of the patrol car, still handcuffed, watching people walk by on the sidewalk. Some stopped and stared, probably wondering what this well-dressed black man had done to get arrested. He had been in dangerous situations before: combat zones, terrorist threats, diplomatic crises. But this felt different. This felt personal and unfair in a way that cut deep. "Let's go," Danny said, opening the back door. "Move it." Robert stepped out carefully, his hands still cuffed behind his back. His expensive suit was wrinkled now and his tie was crooked. As they walked toward the station entrance, a teenage boy with a phone started recording them. Danny noticed and waved him away. "Keep moving, nothing to see here," Danny shouted at the small crowd that was gathering. Inside the station, the desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork. Tom Rodriguez had been working at this station for 15 years, and he had seen Danny bring in a lot of people for questionable reasons. This well-dressed man in handcuffs didn't look like Danny's usual arrests. "What have we got, Walsh?" Tom asked, standing up. "Caught this guy impersonating a military officer," Danny announced proudly. Had a fake ID and everything. Robert finally spoke up. "Sergeant, my name is General Robert Johnson. I'm with the United States Army Pentagon Liaison Division. That ID is real and I need to make a phone call immediately." Tom looked at Robert more carefully. The man spoke with authority and confidence. His posture was military straight despite being handcuffed, and his eyes were calm but serious. Tom had served in the Army himself years ago, and something about this man seemed genuine. "Let me see the ID," Tom said to Danny. Danny reluctantly handed over Robert's military identification. Tom examined it closely under the light. The holographic seal looked real, the photo matched, and the card had the weight and feel of genuine government-issued identification. "Danny, this looks real to me," Tom said quietly. "Come on, Rodriguez. You can buy anything on the internet these days," Danny insisted. "Look at him. Does he look like a general to you?" Robert felt the sting of those words but kept his expression neutral. He had heard comments like that before, usually from people who couldn't imagine a black man in a position of authority. "Officer Walsh," Robert said calmly, "I was on my way to a classified military briefing when you stopped me. My absence will be noticed very soon. I'm asking you as a fellow American to please verify my identity before this goes any further." Danny wasn't backing down. Save the speech. "You're going in a cell until we figure out who you really are." Tom hesitated. Something didn't feel right about this arrest, but Danny was the arresting officer and Tom didn't want to cause problems. "I'll book him," Tom said finally. "But I think we should at least try to verify." "Book him for impersonating a federal officer and resisting arrest," Danny interrupted. "I didn't resist arrest," Robert said firmly. "I cooperated fully and you know it. Are you calling me a liar?" Danny stepped closer to Robert, his voice getting louder. "I'm stating facts," Robert replied without backing down. The tension in the room was thick. Tom could see that Danny was looking for a fight, and he knew it would only make things worse for everyone. "All right, that's enough. Let's just get the paperwork done." As Tom began the booking process, he asked for Robert's basic information. Robert answered every question clearly and consistently. His answers matched the information on his ID, and he knew details that would be impossible to fake. Military protocols, base locations, current operations that only someone with high-level clearance would know. 20 minutes later, Robert was sitting in the station's single holding cell. It was small and clean, but definitely not designed for someone of his rank and status. He had been allowed to keep his watch, and he noted that it was now past 7 o'clock. The briefing he was supposed to attend had already started without him. At the Pentagon, Colonel William Hayes was checking his watch and frowning. General Johnson was never late, especially not for meetings involving national security. They had worked together for 5 years, and Robert was the most punctual person Bill had ever met. "Has anyone heard from General Johnson?" Bill asked the room full of military officials. "His aide said he left on time," replied Major Lisa Chen. "He should have been here an hour ago." Bill felt a knot forming in his stomach. Robert's route took him through several small towns, and anything could have happened. Car accident, medical emergency, or worse. Given the classified nature of their work, there was always the possibility of hostile action. "I'm activating the emergency protocol," Bill announced. "We need to locate General Johnson immediately." Back in Pine Valley, Robert was finally allowed to make his phone call. Danny stood nearby, still convinced he had arrested a fraud. Tom handed Robert the phone, genuinely hoping this would clear everything up quickly. Robert dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a crisp military voice answered. "Pentagon Operations Center, Colonel Hayes speaking." "Bill, this is Robert," he said calmly. "I need immediate assistance. I've been detained by local police in Pine Valley, about 30 miles south of the base." There was a moment of silence on the other end. "Robert, detained? What the hell is going on?" "Long story. Right now I need you to verify my identity with the Pine Valley Police Department and get me out of here. We've got bigger problems if I miss this briefing." "Stand by," Bill said, his voice shifting into crisis mode. "I'm conferencing in the base commander right now." Danny was watching Robert's face during the call, and for the first time he felt a small doubt creeping in. This man was talking like he really did know people in high places. The phone call lasted 3 minutes. When Robert hung up, he looked directly at Danny. "Officer Walsh, I suggest you and your sergeant prepare for some visitors. They'll be here very soon." Danny laughed nervously. "Yeah, right." "Nice try." But Tom Rodriguez wasn't laughing. He had been watching and listening, and everything about this situation was starting to worry him. If this man really was a general, Danny had just created the biggest mess in the department's history. Outside, the first military vehicles were already speeding toward Pine Valley. At the Pentagon, Colonel William Hayes stared at his phone like it had just exploded in his hand. General Robert Johnson, one of the most respected officers in the Army, was sitting in a small-town jail cell. Bill had worked with Robert for years, and he knew this wasn't some misunderstanding or accident. Something had gone very wrong. "Get me General Patricia Morrison on the line now," Bill ordered his assistant. Morrison was the base commander, and she needed to know about this immediately. While waiting for the call to connect, Bill pulled up Robert's file on his computer. The general was currently working on Operation Steadfast, a massive military exercise involving thousands of troops and millions of dollars in equipment. Robert's security clearance was so high that his arrest would automatically trigger multiple federal investigations. "Colonel Hayes, what's the emergency?" General Morrison's voice came through the speaker, sharp and focused. "Ma'am, we have a serious problem. General Johnson has been arrested by local police in Pine Valley. He was on his way to the Steadfast briefing when it happened." There was silence on the other end for several seconds. "Arrested? On what charges?" "I don't have all the details yet, but he said something about impersonating an officer." "Ma'am, I think we're dealing with a case of racial profiling." General Morrison felt her blood pressure rising. She had worked her way up through the ranks in a male-dominated military, and she knew what discrimination looked like. If one of her generals had been arrested simply because some small-town cop couldn't believe a black man could hold such a high position, there would be serious consequences. "Get me the Attorney General's office on line 2, she ordered her aide, "and contact the base's military police. I want a full tactical team ready to move in 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am." "What about the local authorities?" "I'll handle them personally," Morrison said grimly. Back in Pine Valley, Robert sat calmly in his cell, but his mind was racing. He knew that his phone call had just set off a chain reaction that would reach the highest levels of government. The military didn't take kindly to their officers being detained without proper cause, especially when national security was involved. Danny Walsh was filling out paperwork at his desk, still convinced he had made a good arrest. He had dealt with people trying to talk their way out of trouble before, and this seemed like more of the same. Fake military IDs were becoming more common, and Danny figured he was doing his patriotic duty by catching this fraud. Tom Rodriguez, however, was getting more nervous by the minute. He had looked up General Robert Johnson on the computer and found several official military websites that mentioned someone by that name. The photos were small and unclear, but the physical description matched their prisoner exactly. "Danny," Tom called out, "I think we should call the base and verify this guy's story." "We already have his story," Danny replied without looking up. "He's a fake, end of discussion. But what if he's not?" Danny finally looked up from his paperwork. "Rodriguez, use your head. Look at this guy. Does he look like general material to you?" Tom felt uncomfortable with that question, but he didn't want to start an argument. Still, something was bothering him about this whole situation. In his 15 years at the department, he had never seen someone maintain their composure the way this prisoner was doing. Most people who got arrested were angry, scared, or trying to bargain their way out. This man seemed almost patient, like he knew something they didn't. The phone at the front desk rang and Tom answered it. "Pine Valley Police Department. This is General Patricia Morrison, commanding officer of Fort Harrison Military Base. I need to speak with whoever is in charge of your facility immediately." Tom's heart skipped a beat. Just a moment, please." He put the call on hold and looked over at Danny, who was still focused on his paperwork. "Danny, there's a general on the phone asking for whoever's in charge. Tell them the chief isn't here. Take a message." "I think this is about our prisoner." Danny finally looked up, and for the first time, Tom saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What did they say exactly?" "She said she's General Morrison from Fort Harrison. That's the big base about 40 miles north of here." The two officers stared at each other for a moment. Fort Harrison was huge. Everyone in the area knew about it. Thousands of soldiers, tanks, helicopters, and enough firepower to level a small city. If people from that base were calling about their prisoner, "Put it through to my desk," Danny said, trying to sound confident. Danny picked up the phone, clearing his throat. "This is Officer Walsh, Pine Valley Police. Officer Walsh, this is General Morrison. I understand you have one of my officers in custody." "Ma'am, we arrested someone claiming to be a general, but we believe his identification is fraudulent. Describe the suspect." Danny looked through the paperwork. Black male, about 50 years old, 6 feet tall, wearing an expensive suit. Says his name is Robert Johnson. Officer Walsh, General Johnson is one of my most trusted commanders. He has been with the Army for 25 years and holds the highest security clearances. What exactly are the charges against him? Danny felt sweat forming on his forehead. Impersonating a federal officer and resisting arrest. Did he resist arrest? Danny hesitated. The truth was that Robert had been completely cooperative, but Danny had already put resisting arrest in his report. He was argumentative. "I see. Officer Walsh, I'm going to give you some advice. General Johnson is currently assigned to a classified operation that involves national security. His detention is already causing problems that go far beyond your department. I strongly suggest you release him immediately and we can discuss this situation like professionals." "Ma'am, I can't just release someone because of a phone call." "How do I know you're really a general?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Officer Walsh, in about 15 minutes, you're going to see more military vehicles than you've ever seen in your life. I'm trying to handle this quietly, but if you force my hand, this will become a federal incident. Is that really what you want?" Danny looked over at Tom, who was shaking his head frantically. Through the window, they could already see people gathering on the street outside, pointing at the police station and talking excitedly. I need to verify some things," Danny said weakly. "You do that, Officer Walsh, but do it quickly." The line went dead and Danny stared at the phone in his hand. For the first time since making the arrest, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. In his cell, Robert heard the distant sound of heavy engines approaching. He smiled slightly and checked his watch again. Right on schedule. He had served with General Morrison for years, and he knew she didn't make idle threats. Pine Valley was about to get a lesson in military efficiency. At Fort Harrison Military Base, alarms were not literally sounding, but they might as well have been. The base's emergency operations center buzzed with activity, as dozens of personnel worked phones, computers, and communication equipment. News of General Johnson's arrest had spread through the command structure like wildfire, and everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. Major Lisa Chen burst into General Morrison's office without knocking, something she would never do under normal circumstances. "Ma'am, we have a problem. The Steadfast operation is falling behind schedule without General Johnson. The other commanders are asking questions." General Morrison looked up from the tactical map spread across her desk. "Tell them there's been a security incident and that General Johnson will be back shortly. Don't give them any details yet." "Yes, ma'am." Also, the FBI field office called. They heard about the arrest through their monitoring systems and want to know if this is related to any ongoing threats against military personnel. Morrison rubbed her temples. A simple traffic stop was turning into a multi-agency crisis. Tell the FBI we'll brief them as soon as we have the general back safely. Right now, I need to focus on getting our people moving. In the base's motor pool, Sergeant First Class David Kim was inspecting the 3 M1 Abrams tanks that had been ordered for immediate deployment. He had been working on tanks for 12 years, but he had never been told to prepare them for domestic operations. Something big was happening, and everyone on base could feel the tension. Sergeant Kim, what's our status? Captain James Wright jogged up to the motor pool, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. All 3 tanks are fueled and ready, sir. The crews are doing final checks now. But sir, are we really taking tanks into a civilian area? Captain Wright understood Kim's concern. Deploying military vehicles in American towns was serious business, usually reserved for natural disasters or extreme emergencies. We're making a show of force, Sergeant. One of our generals has been unlawfully detained, and we need to make it clear that the military takes care of its own. The tank crews were some of the best trained soldiers on the base. They knew their equipment inside and out, and they understood the power of the machines they operated. But rolling through a small American town was very different from their usual training exercises. Listen up, Captain Wright addressed the assembled soldiers. We're going to Pine Valley to retrieve General Johnson. This is not a combat operation. We're going there to show presence and authority. Keep your weapons secure, follow all traffic laws, and remember that the whole country might be watching. 20 miles away, FBI agent Rebecca Torres was driving toward Pine Valley as fast as she legally could. She had been monitoring police communications when she heard about the arrest of someone claiming to be a military general. When she ran the name Robert Johnson through federal databases, red flags appeared immediately. General Johnson wasn't just any officer. He had top-secret clearance and was involved in operations that affected national security. His arrest could be anything from a simple misunderstanding to a coordinated attack on military leadership. Either way, the FBI needed to be involved. Rebecca called her supervisor while driving. Sir, I'm en route to Pine Valley. The situation is escalating rapidly. Fort Harrison has deployed military assets. Deployed? What kind of assets? Unknown at this time, but local radio chatter suggests it's significant. I should be on scene in 15 minutes. Torres, this better not turn into another federal overreach story. The last thing we need is bad press about military forces intimidating local police. I understand, sir, but if this general really was arrested without cause, we have a civil rights violation on our hands. Back at the Pine Valley Police Station, Chief of Police Michael Roberts had just received the most disturbing phone call of his career. He had been at home, enjoying dinner with his family, when his desk sergeant called to tell him that they had arrested someone claiming to be a general and that the military was sending forces to retrieve him. Chief Roberts was 62 years old and had been in law enforcement for 40 years. He had seen plenty of unusual situations, but nothing like this. He drove to the station as quickly as he could, his mind racing with questions and concerns. When he arrived, he found Danny Walsh pacing nervously around the front desk, while Tom Rodriguez tried to handle a constantly ringing phone. Through the windows, Roberts could see crowds of people gathering on the street, many holding cell phones and taking pictures. Walsh. Rodriguez. Conference room now, Roberts barked. Once they were alone, Roberts closed the door and looked at both officers seriously. Tell me exactly what happened and don't leave out any details. Danny explained the traffic stop, his suspicions about the fake ID, and his decision to make the arrest. As he talked, Roberts noticed that Danny's story kept changing slightly, and he wasn't making eye contact. Did you verify the ID through any official channels? Roberts asked. No, sir. It looked fake to me. Did the suspect resist arrest or threaten you in any way? He was argumentative, Danny said, but his voice lacked conviction. Roberts turned to Tom. Rodriguez, what's your take on this? Chief, I think we made a mistake. This guy doesn't act like any criminal I've ever seen. He's calm, polite, and his story hasn't changed at all. Plus, I looked him up online, and there really is a General Robert Johnson who matches his description. Roberts felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. In his 40 years of police work, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him that Danny had arrested an innocent man for no good reason. "Where is the prisoner now?" "In holding cell 1, Tom replied. "I want to see him immediately." As they walked toward the holding area, Roberts could hear the distant rumble of heavy vehicles getting closer. Through the station's windows, they could see car headlights and flashing lights approaching from multiple directions. "Chief," Tom said quietly, "I think the cavalry is coming." Roberts looked at his watch. Less than 2 hours had passed since the arrest, and already the situation was spinning out of control. If this man really was a general, Danny's prejudice and poor judgment had just created a crisis that would affect their entire department. In his cell, General Johnson sat quietly, listening to the approaching vehicles. He had served in enough military operations to recognize the sound of tanks and heavy trucks. General Morrison was bringing serious firepower to Pine Valley, and the local police were about to get a very expensive lesson in military protocol. The sound of engines grew louder, and through the small window of his cell, Robert could see the first flashes of headlights reflecting off the buildings across the street. Soon, the entire block would be surrounded by military vehicles, and this small-town police station would become the center of a national incident. He straightened his tie and prepared to meet his rescuers. The ground began to vibrate before anyone could see what was coming. People standing on the sidewalks outside the Pine Valley police station felt the rumbling through their feet, like a small earthquake approaching from the north. Car alarms started going off randomly as the vibrations intensified. Then they appeared around the corner. 3 massive M1 Abrams tanks rolled down Main Street in perfect formation, their 68-ton frames making the asphalt crack under their weight. The lead tank's commander stood in the turret, surveying the scene with professional calm. Behind the tanks came a convoy of military police vehicles, their red and blue lights flashing in sync with their sirens. People on the street stopped whatever they were doing and stared. Children pointed with wide eyes while their parents pulled out phones to record the unprecedented scene. In 40 years of existence, Pine Valley had never seen anything like this. Inside the police station, everyone froze as the building shook from the approaching vehicles. Chief Roberts rushed to the window and felt his heart skip a beat as he watched the tanks position themselves around the building. This wasn't just a show of force, it was an overwhelming demonstration of military power. "Holy mother of..." Tom Rodriguez whispered, his face pressed against another window. Danny Walsh had gone completely pale. The tanks were massive, intimidating, and impossible to ignore. Each one could probably drive through the police station like it was made of cardboard. For the first time since making the arrest, Danny began to truly understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Chief, what do we do?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Roberts could answer, a crisp knock came at the front door. Through the glass, they could see a woman in military uniform standing at attention. Her posture was perfect, her uniform immaculate, and her expression deadly serious. Chief Roberts straightened his own uniform and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with General Patricia Morrison. Even without knowing her rank, Roberts could tell immediately that this was someone accustomed to command. "Chief Roberts, I presume?" Morrison's voice was polite but carried an undertone of controlled anger. "Yes, ma'am. You must be General Morrison." "I am. I'm here to collect one of my officers who has been unlawfully detained by your department." Roberts nodded toward the back of the station. "Ma'am, if you'll follow me, we can discuss this situation and get it resolved quickly." As they walked through the station, Morrison noticed the nervous glances from the other officers. She had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous places in the world, but she had never felt as angry as she did right now. One of her best generals was sitting in a jail cell because some small-town cop couldn't believe that a black man could hold a position of authority. They stopped in front of the holding cell, where General Johnson sat calmly on the small bench. When he saw Morrison, he stood and smiled slightly. "Patricia, thanks for coming," Robert said casually, as if they were meeting for coffee instead of a jailbreak. "Robert, are you injured? Did they mistreat you in any way?" "No physical harm. Just some wounded pride and a reminder that some things never change." Morrison turned to face Chief Roberts, her expression hardening. "Chief, I want to see the arrest report and speak with the arresting officer immediately." Roberts called Danny over, and Morrison studied him carefully. Danny was sweating despite the cool evening air, and he couldn't seem to make eye contact with anyone. "Officer Walsh, explain to me why you arrested General Johnson." Danny cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, I stopped him for speeding, and when I asked for identification, he presented what appeared to be a fraudulent military ID." "Appeared fraudulent how?" It just didn't look right to me." Morrison's patience was wearing thin. "Did you attempt to verify the identification through any official channels?" "No, ma'am. I didn't think it was necessary." "You didn't think it was necessary." Morrison repeated the words slowly, letting their absurdity sink in. "Officer Walsh, did General Johnson resist arrest?" He was argumentative. "That's not what I asked." "Did he physically resist arrest?" Danny shifted uncomfortably. "No, ma'am." Morrison looked at the arrest report that Chief Roberts had handed her. Under charges, she saw impersonating a federal officer and resisting arrest. "Officer Walsh, falsifying an arrest report is a federal crime. Are you sure you want to maintain that General Johnson resisted arrest?" Danny looked desperately at Chief Roberts, who was staring at the floor. Maybe I was mistaken about that part." Outside, more vehicles were arriving. FBI agent Rebecca Torres pulled up to see military personnel establishing a perimeter around the entire block. She badged her way past the military police and entered the station, just as Morrison was finishing her conversation with Danny Walsh. "Agent Torres, FBI," she announced, showing her credentials. "I'm here to investigate potential civil rights violations." Chief Roberts felt the situation slipping further out of his control. First the military, now the FBI. What had started as a simple traffic stop was becoming a federal incident. Morrison turned to Torres. "Agent Torres, I appreciate the Bureau's interest, but right now I just want to collect my officer and return to base." "I understand, General, but if there's been a violation of civil rights, we need to document everything properly." Robert finally spoke up from his cell. "If I may suggest, perhaps we could continue this discussion after I'm released. I do have a rather important briefing to attend." Morrison looked at Chief Roberts expectantly. "Chief?" Roberts pulled out his keys and unlocked the cell door. "General Johnson, you're free to go. On behalf of the Pine Valley Police Department, I apologize for this misunderstanding." Robert stepped out of the cell and straightened his suit jacket. "Thank you, Chief. I appreciate your professionalism in resolving this matter." As they walked toward the front of the station, Torres pulled out a recording device. "General, would you be willing to give a statement about what happened here tonight?" "Agent Torres, I'll be happy to cooperate with your investigation. Right now, however, I have duties that can't wait any longer." Outside, a crowd of several hundred people had gathered to watch the extraordinary scene. News trucks were arriving, having heard about the military response on police scanners. The story was already spreading on social media, with videos of tanks in downtown Pine Valley going viral. Morrison escorted Robert to one of the military vehicles, while Captain Wright coordinated the withdrawal of the tanks. The massive vehicles began their slow journey back to base, leaving deep tracks in the asphalt as evidence of their visit. As Robert climbed into the passenger seat of Morrison's command vehicle, he looked back at the police station. Through the windows, he could see Danny Walsh sitting at a desk with his head in his hands, while Chief Roberts tried to answer questions from reporters who had managed to get past the military perimeter. "Patricia," Robert said as they drove away, "remind me to send a thank you note to whoever designed that show of force. I don't think Pine Valley will forget this night anytime soon." Morrison smiled grimly. "Neither will Officer Walsh. The FBI will make sure of that." Behind them, Pine Valley was buzzing with activity as news crews, federal agents, and curious citizens tried to piece together what had just happened. The quiet small town had just become the center of a national conversation about justice, authority, and respect. The Pine Valley Police Station felt like a different place after the tanks left. The building seemed smaller somehow, as if the presence of such overwhelming military force had changed its very nature. Chief Roberts stood in his office, staring out at the street where tank tracks were still visible in the asphalt, wondering how his quiet department had become the center of a national incident. FBI agent Rebecca Torres had set up a temporary command post in the station's conference room. Her laptop was open, recording equipment was arranged on the table, and she was methodically interviewing everyone who had been involved in the arrest. The federal investigation was just beginning. "Officer Walsh, please sit down," Torres said as Danny entered the room. He looked exhausted and defeated, like a man who had just watched his career collapse in real time. Danny slumped into the chair across from Torres, avoiding eye contact. Behind him, his union representative sat silently, knowing that this case would be difficult to defend. "Let's start from the beginning," Torres said, activating her recording device. "Tell me about the traffic stop." Danny's story had changed several times since the arrest, and Torres had noticed every inconsistency. As he spoke, she occasionally stopped him to ask for clarification or to point out contradictions with his earlier statements. "You said General Johnson was speeding. Do you have radar evidence of this?" "No, I was just observing his speed." "Your police car doesn't have radar?" "It does, but I didn't use it." Torres made a note. "So you have no objective evidence that he was breaking any traffic laws?" Danny shifted in his seat. "I know what I saw. Officer Walsh, I've reviewed the security footage from the gas station where you were parked. The timestamp shows that General Johnson's vehicle passed by at exactly the speed limit. Would you like to revise your statement?" Danny's union representative leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Danny nodded slowly. "Maybe I was mistaken about the speeding, so why did you stop him?" For the first time, Danny looked directly at Torres. "He was driving an expensive car through our town. We get a lot of drug dealers coming through, and I thought he might be suspicious." "What made him suspicious? The expensive car or something else?" Danny hesitated, realizing he was walking into dangerous territory. "Just, the whole situation seemed off." Torres had interviewed hundreds of suspects and witnesses during her career, and she could read between the lines. Danny Walsh had stopped General Johnson for driving while black, one of the oldest forms of racial profiling in American law enforcement. Meanwhile, in Chief Roberts' office, the phone had been ringing nonstop. News organizations from around the country wanted statements about the incident. The mayor was demanding answers. The state police superintendent was asking questions. And worst of all, the Department of Justice had called to say they were opening a formal investigation into the department's practices. Roberts knocked on the conference room door and entered. "Agent Torres, I need to speak with you privately." They stepped into the hallway where Roberts could speak freely. "Agent Torres, I've been reviewing Officer Walsh's personnel file." This isn't his first complaint involving racial issues. Torres wasn't surprised. "How many complaints?" 7 in the past 3 years, all involving traffic stops of minority drivers. I should have paid more attention, but we're a small department and, Chief, you don't need to explain to me, but you should know that this incident is going to bring scrutiny to all of those cases." Roberts nodded grimly. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that the federal government didn't send tanks and FBI agents for isolated incidents. This was going to be a comprehensive investigation of his entire department. Back in the conference room, Danny was answering questions about his training and his understanding of proper police procedures. With each question, it became clear that he had violated multiple department policies and federal civil rights laws. "Did you receive training on how to verify military identification?" "Some, but not recently." "Are you aware that federal law requires you to make reasonable efforts to verify government credentials when they're presented?" "I thought it was fake." "Based on what evidence?" Danny couldn't answer. The truth was that he had decided the ID was fake the moment he saw that General Johnson was black. Everything after that had been an attempt to justify his prejudice. Torres closed her laptop and looked at Danny seriously. "Officer Walsh, I'm going to be direct with you. You arrested a high-ranking military officer without cause, falsified charges against him, and violated his civil rights. These are federal crimes that carry serious penalties." Danny's union representative finally spoke up. "Agent Torres, my client was acting in good faith according to his training and experience. His training should have taught him how to verify credentials. His experience should have told him that people don't usually impersonate military generals. And good faith doesn't explain why he added false charges to the arrest report." Outside the station, news crews were setting up for live broadcasts. The story had all the elements that made for compelling television: racial injustice, military drama, and a small town that had bitten off more than it could chew. Reporter Jennifer Kim was preparing for her live shot when she noticed an elderly black man approaching the police station. He walked with a slight limp and wore a veteran's cap. "Excuse me, sir," Jennifer called out. "Are you here about the incident tonight?" The man stopped and looked at her seriously. "My name is Charles Washington. I served under General Johnson in Iraq. That man saved my life and the lives of 50 other soldiers when our convoy was attacked. If some racist cop thinks he can disrespect a hero like that, he's got another thing coming." Jennifer realized she had stumbled onto another angle of the story. "Would you be willing to go on camera and talk about General Johnson?" "Lady, I'd talk to anyone who'll listen. That general is one of the finest men I've ever known, and what happened here tonight is a disgrace." As the evening wore on, more veterans began arriving at the police station. Word had spread through military networks that one of their own had been mistreated, and they wanted to show their support. Soon, dozens of former soldiers were gathered outside, many wearing their old uniforms or veteran caps. Inside the station, Chief Roberts watched the growing crowd through his window. These weren't protesters or troublemakers. They were American veterans who had served their country with honor. Their presence added moral weight to an already difficult situation. Agent Torres finished her interview with Danny Walsh and began reviewing the evidence. The case was straightforward. A police officer had allowed his racial prejudice to override his professional judgment, resulting in the unlawful arrest of a military general. The federal charges would be easy to prove, but Torres knew that this incident was about more than just one bad cop. It was a symptom of larger problems in American policing, problems that would require systematic change to fix. As midnight approached, Pine Valley began to quiet down. The news crews would return tomorrow, the federal investigation would continue, and Officer Danny Walsh would soon find himself facing the consequences of his actions. The truth was now clear to everyone. General Robert Johnson had been arrested for no reason other than the color of his skin, and in trying to cover up his mistake, Danny Walsh had only made things worse for himself and his department. Justice was coming to Pine Valley, whether they were ready for it or not. 6 weeks after the incident, Pine Valley looked like a completely different town. Federal investigators had been coming and going daily. News trucks were still parked on Main Street, and the police station had become an unwelcome tourist attraction. People drove from neighboring towns just to see where the general got arrested, and some even posed for photos next to the tank tracks that were still visible in the asphalt. Chief Roberts sat in his office, reading through the Department of Justice's preliminary report. The findings were damning but not surprising. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory policing that went back years. Officer Walsh wasn't the only problem. He was just the most obvious one. The report detailed 17 separate incidents where minority drivers had been stopped without proper cause. It documented inadequate training, poor supervision, and a departmental culture that had allowed prejudice to flourish unchecked. Most painful for Roberts was the conclusion that he, as chief, had failed in his duty to ensure fair and professional policing. Danny Walsh was no longer a police officer. He had been fired 3 days after the arrest, and federal prosecutors had filed charges against him for violating General Johnson's civil rights. His mugshot had been all over the news, and his name had become synonymous with police misconduct. Danny's lawyer had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the case was too high profile for the government to show leniency. The Department of Justice wanted to send a message that federal officials, especially military officers, would be protected from abuse by local law enforcement. Mr. Walsh, Federal Judge Catherine Torres had said during his arraignment, "You swore an oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. Instead, you used your badge to harass and humiliate a decorated war hero. This court will not tolerate such behavior." Danny now faced up to 10 years in federal prison. His police pension was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his family had received death threats from angry citizens who saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. But the consequences extended far beyond Danny Walsh. The entire Pine Valley Police Department was now under federal oversight. Every policy had to be reviewed and approved by DOJ monitors. Every officer had to undergo extensive retraining on civil rights and proper procedures. The department's budget had doubled due to compliance costs, and the town was struggling to pay for it all. Mayor Linda Foster had called an emergency town meeting to discuss the situation. The Pine Valley Community Center was packed with angry residents who were tired of being in the national spotlight for all the wrong reasons. "This is costing us a fortune," complained local business owner Mike Chen. "The federal monitors are charging us $3,000 a day, and for what? To teach our cops not to be racist? Maybe if we had taught them that in the first place, we wouldn't be in this mess," replied community activist Rosa Martinez. "General Johnson could have sued us for millions. We're lucky he chose not to." The meeting grew heated as residents argued about whether the federal intervention was necessary or excessive. Some supported the reforms, believing they were long overdue. Others resented what they saw as government overreach and blamed General Johnson for making a big deal out of a simple misunderstanding. General Johnson himself had returned to his duties at the Pentagon, but the incident had affected him more than he let on. He had given several interviews about the experience, always maintaining his professional composure while making it clear that police reform was urgently needed. "This wasn't about me personally," he had told CNN's Anderson Cooper. "This was about a system that allows officers to make assumptions based on race rather than facts. If it can happen to a general, imagine what happens to ordinary citizens who don't have tanks coming to rescue them." The interview had been watched by millions of people and had sparked a national conversation about racial profiling in law enforcement. Civil rights organizations used General Johnson's case as an example of how prejudice affected people at every level of society. At Fort Harrison, General Morrison had implemented new protocols for military personnel traveling through civilian areas. All officers now carried special identification cards with direct phone numbers to military police, and base commanders were required to establish relationships with local law enforcement agencies to prevent similar incidents. The changes went beyond policy. General Johnson's arrest had reminded the military community that their service members were not immune to discrimination, and it had strengthened their resolve to protect each other. "We take care of our own," Morrison had told her staff, "and that means making sure that no soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine is ever treated the way General Johnson was treated." The federal criminal case against Danny Walsh moved forward quickly. Prosecutors had overwhelming evidence: the security footage showing General Johnson wasn't speeding, the falsified arrest report, the failure to verify credentials, and the clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Danny's trial lasted only 3 days. The jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty on all charges. As the verdict was read, Danny sat silently at the defense table, finally understanding the full weight of his actions. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Torres said during sentencing, "you betrayed the public trust and violated the constitutional rights of a man who has dedicated his life to serving this country. Your actions brought shame on law enforcement and damaged the relationship between police and the communities they serve." Danny was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. He would also have to pay restitution and perform community service focused on civil rights education. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the change in Pine Valley itself. The federal oversight had forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about race and policing. Community groups that had never worked together before were now collaborating on police reform initiatives. Tom Rodriguez, who had tried to voice concerns about General Johnson's arrest, was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of training new officers. His first lesson always focused on the night when tanks came to Pine Valley. "Remember," he would tell new recruits, "every person you encounter deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. It doesn't matter what they look like or what car they drive. Your job is to serve and protect everyone equally." The tank tracks in the asphalt had finally been repaired, but their memory lived on. Local artists had created a mural depicting the incident, and the town council had approved a small memorial plaque, acknowledging the injustice that had occurred. General Johnson had been invited to the dedication ceremony, and he had surprised everyone by accepting. Standing before a crowd of Pine Valley residents, he spoke about forgiveness, healing, and the importance of learning from mistakes. "This town made an error," he said, "but it also chose to do better. That's what America is supposed to be about, not perfection, but progress." As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Robert Johnson shook hands with Chief Roberts, who was still struggling to rebuild his department's reputation. "General," Roberts said quietly, "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm truly sorry for what happened to you here." Johnson looked at the man who had inherited such a difficult situation and nodded. "Chief, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we respond to them. Your department is going to be better because of this experience." As Johnson drove away from Pine Valley for the second time, he reflected on how much had changed since that night 6 weeks ago. A small town had been forced to confront its prejudices. A police department had been reformed, and hopefully, other officers around the country would think twice before making assumptions based on race. The tanks were gone, but their message remained. Justice would be protected, and those who violated it would face the consequences. 1 year later, Pine Valley had become an unlikely symbol of redemption and reform. The small town that had once made national headlines for all the wrong reasons was now being studied as a model for how communities could recover from police misconduct scandals. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a criminologist from the State University, had been documenting Pine Valley's transformation for her research on police reform. Walking through downtown on a sunny Tuesday morning, she noticed changes that went far beyond new police procedures. The community center hosted weekly forums where residents could discuss their concerns with law enforcement. The local library had created a civil rights education program. Most significantly, the police department had become genuinely integrated into the community, rather than standing apart from it. Chief Roberts had initially considered retiring after the federal investigation, but he had decided to stay and help rebuild. The past year had been the most challenging of his career, but also the most rewarding. His department now had the highest community approval ratings in the county. "Dr. Rodriguez," Roberts said as they met in his office, "I won't lie to you. The first few months were hell. But we had a choice. We could fight the changes or embrace them. We chose to embrace them." The statistics backed up his words. Complaints against the police had dropped by 80%. Traffic stops showed no racial disparities. Community trust as measured by surveys had reached historic highs. The federal oversight would end soon, and Pine Valley's police department would be held up as an example of successful reform. Tom Rodriguez, now the department's training director, had developed a curriculum that was being adopted by police academies across the state. His Pine Valley protocol emphasized de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of verifying information before making arrests. "Every new officer learns about General Johnson on their first day," Tom explained to visiting police chiefs from other departments, "not to embarrass anyone, but to understand what happens when we let prejudice override professionalism." The most visible change in Pine Valley was the Heroes Memorial that had been built in the town square. It honored all local veterans, with a special section dedicated to military leaders who had faced discrimination. General Johnson's name was prominently displayed, along with a quote from his speech at the dedication ceremony. "True strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves." But the impact of that night reached far beyond Pine Valley's borders. The General Johnson case had become a landmark in civil rights law, cited in court decisions and legal textbooks across the country. Police departments nationwide had revised their training programs to include lessons about verifying credentials and avoiding racial profiling. At the Pentagon, General Johnson had been promoted to Deputy Chief of Staff, partly in recognition of how professionally he had handled the Pine Valley incident. He still traveled frequently for his duties, but now he carried special documentation that made his military status unmistakable to any police officer who might stop him. More importantly, the military had established the Johnson Protocol, emergency procedures for when service members faced unlawful detention by civilian authorities. No general would ever again have to sit in a small town jail cell while tanks were deployed to secure his release. Danny Walsh had served his prison sentence and was now working as a warehouse supervisor in another state. The federal conviction meant he could never work in law enforcement again, and he struggled daily with the knowledge that his moment of prejudice had destroyed his career and damaged his family. In rare interviews, Danny expressed regret for his actions, but his words often rang hollow. Some people questioned whether he was truly sorry or just sorry he got caught. Regardless, his case had become a cautionary tale taught in police academies as an example of how quickly a career could end when officers violated citizens' rights. FBI Agent Rebecca Torres had been promoted to head the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, largely based on her work in the Pine Valley case. She now traveled the country investigating similar incidents and training local law enforcement on federal civil rights laws. The General Johnson case changed everything. Torres told a conference of police chiefs in Washington, D.C. It showed that the federal government will act decisively when citizens' rights are violated, regardless of the victim's race or status. Every officer in America needs to understand that message. The case had also influenced federal legislation. Congress had passed the Military Personnel Protection Act, which made it a specific federal crime to unlawfully detain active duty service members. The law carried enhanced penalties and required special training for police officers in areas near military bases. General Morrison, now commanding general of the Army's Eastern Region, had made police-military relations a priority throughout her command. She regularly met with local law enforcement leaders to ensure they understood military protocols and to prevent future incidents. What happened in Pine Valley should never happen again. Morrison told a gathering of military and civilian leaders, "Our service members deserve better, and American citizens deserve better." The Pine Valley incident had also sparked changes within the military itself. The Army had created new programs to educate service members about their rights during police encounters, and had established rapid response teams to assist soldiers who faced discrimination. At Fort Harrison, a new training center bore General Johnson's name. Young officers learned about leadership, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when facing injustice. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night was the conversation it had started about race, respect, and responsibility in America. The image of tanks surrounding a small-town police station had forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about how Black Americans were treated by law enforcement, regardless of their achievements or service to their country. General Johnson, now in his final years of military service, often spoke to young people about the importance of perseverance in the face of injustice. His message was always the same: don't let other people's prejudices define your limits. Keep serving, keep achieving, and keep proving them wrong. The Pine Valley Police Department now hosted annual visits from military personnel, creating relationships that prevented misunderstandings and built mutual respect. The town's children grew up seeing soldiers and police officers working together, learning that authority should be exercised with wisdom and fairness. On the anniversary of the incident, Pine Valley held its first Unity Day celebration. General Johnson was the keynote speaker, addressing a crowd that included many of the same people who had witnessed his arrest a year earlier. "This town taught me something important," Johnson told the gathering. "It showed me that even when people make mistakes, even serious ones, they can choose to do better." Pine Valley chose to do better, and that choice made all the difference. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave, an elderly veteran approached General Johnson. Charles Washington, who had served under Johnson in Iraq, shook his former commander's hand. "General, you always told us that every soldier matters regardless of rank or background. That night proved you were right. When they came for you, the whole army came with them." Johnson smiled, remembering the sound of tanks rolling through the quiet streets of Pine Valley. "Charles, that's what families do. They protect each other." The tank tracks were long gone from Main Street, but their memory remained. They had marked a moment when America was forced to confront its failures and choose a better path forward. In Pine Valley, at least, that choice had led to genuine change. The story of General Johnson's arrest had ended with justice served and lessons learned. But more importantly, it had begun a new chapter in the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in America, a chapter that was still being written every day in small towns and big cities across the country. Sometimes, it takes tanks in the street to remind people that justice cannot be ignored. But once that reminder is given, it's up to each community to decide what they'll do with the second chance they've been given. Pine Valley had made its choice, and the whole nation was watching to see who would follow their example.